Order, please. Before we start the daily routine, I have a brief speaker's ruling I'd like to give to the House today before we start. On April the 17th, the Honourable House Leader of the Official Opposition rose on a point of order in response to a notice of motion of a resolution given by the member for Truro Bible Hill. It was his position that the member for Truro Bible Hill was imputing bad motive to his leader and the party because the resolution referred to tainted funds and also referred to past activities that have been found to have been illegal. I have looked carefully at the language used in the operative clause of the resolution. I have concluded it does not contain an imputation of bad motive, but I understand why the Honourable House Leader objected to the linking of the two matters, and I caution all members against suggesting illegal activity by any member of the Assembly. Such a suggestion would be unparliamentary. I have concluded that the matter is a disagreement between members over facts. Thank you. Before we start the daily routine, I will also give the subject matter for late debate tonight. The subject matter reads, therefore be it resolved that the Leader of the Official Opposition explain to Nova Scotians why the Liberal Party has misled Nova Scotians by making statements like those from the member from Dartmouth East that the New Brunswick energy market is working just fine, when the recent New Brunswick decision has blown yet another hole through the Liberal energy plan. So sooner after their last misguided attempt to woo Hydro-Quebec, submitted by the Honourable Member for Lunenburg West. The Honourable Leader of the Official Government, the Honourable House Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, just on a point of information, it's my understanding that the member for Halifax Atlantic rose on a point of privilege some time ago in this House, and I don't believe there's been a ruling on that matter as of yet. In light of how this session is progressing, I'm wondering if the Speaker could advise as to whether we can expect a ruling on that point of privilege by the member for Halifax Atlantic
tomorrow.
Anytime soon.
Tomorrow. Tomorrow. Very complicated. Very complicated. But it will be done tomorrow before. I promise you that. I had a meeting with my staff this morning over it. Okay. Daily routine, presenting and reading petitions. Presenting reports of committees, the Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as Chair of the Law Amendments of the Committee on Law Amendments, I am directed to report that the committee has met and considered the following bill, Bill number 70, an act representing the practices of medical imaging and radiation therapy professionals, and the committee recommends that this bill to the favourable consideration of the House without amendment. As well, Mr. Speaker, as the...
Excuse me. Order that these bills be referred to the Committee of the Whole House on Bills. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Justice.
Yes, and further to that, as the Chair of the Law Amendments Committee, I am directed to report that the committee has met and considered the following bills. Bill number 76, an act to amend Chapter 2 of the Revised Statute of 1989, the Adult Protection Act, and Bill number 78, an act to amend Chapter 3 of the Act of 1987, the Canada and Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Resource Accord Implementation Nova Scotia Act, and the committee recommends these bills to the favourable consideration of the House with certain amendments.
Order that these bills be referred to the Committee of the Whole House on Bills. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers, the Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was asked during question period yesterday to table a log of the helicopter use, so I'm pleased this afternoon from the Department of Natural Resources to table the Natural Resources Flight Utilization Report for the period starting January 1st, 2012, ending February 28th, 2013. So I'll table that for the House.
Thank you. The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, his staff had provided us with a copy of that yesterday, but the fact is the request was for logs from the period of 2009 till now. So I would hope that the Minister would be able to provide us with that information today. Thank you.
Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table the amendments, the annual report of the Chief Electoral Officer for ending March 31st, 2013.
The report is tabled. Statements by Minister. The Honourable Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize this week as Road Safety Week. The first thing we need to know is that this week is not selected as Road Safety Week on a whim. Road Safety Week begins in May every year. That's because more cars are on the road as the snow disappears and the weather warms up. Mr. Speaker, before I became Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal, I thought more traffic collisions took place in the winter, the time when roads can be slippery and conditions difficult. That is not the case. All across North America, as the temperatures go up, so does the number of highway fatalities. People speed, people drink, people lose their focus, and people lose their lives. Mr. Speaker, 84 people died on Nova Scotia's highways this last year. 39 of those deaths, that's 46%, occurred in the 4 months from June through September. So clearly, summer can be a dangerous time for drivers, cyclists, and pedestrians. At Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal, every time I talk about a traffic accident, I get my wrist slapped by one of our safety experts. When you say accident, it implies that it is nobody's fault. The unfortunate truth is that it usually is somebody's fault. Somebody was speeding, somebody was impaired, somebody was distracted, somebody was unbuckled. Everybody knows these factors contribute to fatalities, and yet these behaviors continue. Mr. Speaker, it's heartbreaking to think that most of these deaths could have been avoided. By simply following the rules of the road that we all know, lives would be saved. Let's talk about seatbelts, for example, Mr. Speaker. It's been 29 years since seatbelts legislation came into being in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia has an overall seatbelt usage rate of more than 90%. That is excellent. However, 30% of the people killed on our highways last year were not wearing seatbelts. If 90% of those 84 fatalities had been wearing their seatbelts, instead of 70%, lives would have been saved. Impairment. Let's talk about impairment, Mr. Speaker. There are many kinds, of which alcohol is only one. Society is showing an increased tolerance for the so-called recreational drugs, Mr. Speaker. But I'm here to tell you that impairment through marijuana is just as lethal as impairment through alcohol. And don't forget fatigue. That too is a form of impairment, and that too can be fatal. Our experience and our road safety experts tell us that the person not wearing their seatbelt is also more likely to be the one who is speeding and is also more likely to be driving while impaired. There's basically a perfect storm for a traffic danger. What do we do to reach these people? We make new laws, we step up enforcement, we invest millions of dollars in maintaining and improving highways, roads, and bridges. We design safe new highways, we add rumble strips, we run education campaigns. Last week, we called attention to motorcycle safety by declaring May to be Motorcycle Safety Awareness Month. This week is Road Safety Week. Next week, we are partnering with the Nova Scotia Road Builders on a $60,000 ad campaign to encourage drivers to slow down through the highway work zones. Recognizing that we can't do this alone, we work with many road safety partners. These include other government departments, all enforcement agencies, and private groups such as Mothers Against Drunk Driving, Injury Free Nova Scotia, Child Safety Link, Safety Services Nova Scotia, and the Ecology Action Centre, Mr. Speaker. We're part of Nova Scotia's Road Safety Advisory Committee that examines road safety issues. We have direct traffic officers who are on the road throughout Nova Scotia to investigate when someone has a safety concern about one of our highways. All Nova Scotians have a responsibility to road safety. We must work together to remind each other to respect everyone and ourselves by driving and riding sober and traveling mindfully and courteously. I appreciate and support all of our road safety staff and partners. Keep up the good work. I thank our first responders, police and RCMP officers, paramedics, firefighters, and our vehicle compliance officers for what they have to do when something goes wrong on our highways. Please keep up the good work. I encourage all Nova Scotians to enjoy the summer and drive safely. Slow down, buckle up, drive sober, leave your cell phone and other gadgets out of reach. Leave enough time on your trip so you can stop to enjoy all the things this glorious province has to offer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of our transportation critic, the member for Clare, I'm pleased to rise to offer a few words in response to the Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal's statement regarding Road Safety Week. First, we'd like to thank the Minister for providing us with an advance copy of his remarks today. Safety on our highways is the most important aspect of driving. Whether it's a car, truck, bicycle, or if you're a pedestrian, taking precautions to ensure safety on roads saves lives. The Minister rightly points out that safety measures such as seatbelts save lives every single day. And we simply cannot do enough to make certain that Nova Scotians and all motorists on our highways do not drive under the influence of any substance. The Minister speaks about investments in highways, bridges, and roads. And while there are improvements being made, I would like to remind the Minister about the many secondary roads in our province that are in disrepair, where reckless driving may occur more often. I would be remiss as well to remind the Minister of the need to continue and expedite the twinning process between the 104 in New Glasgow all the way to the Canso Causeway, which is a major thoroughfare for traffic, commercial vehicles, not only from Cape Breton and eastern Nova Scotia, but as well from the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. It is important to keep these roads in good condition and keep up our enforcement efforts to stop such incidents as bad driving. Road safety applies to everyone, not just motorists. Crosswalk safety and taking care while walking the roads and streets is just as important, and I'm pleased that our caucus has been very vocal on the need for better crosswalk safety. Awareness for both motorists and pedestrians can be life-saving indeed. I would urge the Minister to continue efforts to keep crosswalk safety and pedestrian awareness on the minds of all Nova Scotians, rural and urban. As well, Speaker, I'd be remiss if I did not encourage the Minister to work with his colleague, the Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations, to work in conjunction with municipalities that are trying to construct sidewalks in their communities so that residents can walk safely without having to rely on the gravel shoulder of the road or walking on the road, which can be very dangerous. And as well, we have certainly been strong advocates in our caucus for bicycle lanes as well, especially when new road construction is taking place, which unfortunately I don't believe a policy has been brought in. As well, Mr. Speaker, I was reminded on the issue of safety by one of my colleagues that while our province has implemented a law that requires drivers to have running daytime running lights on at all times, one just has to take a trip on our highways to see that many vehicles continue not to have any lights on while they are driving, and we would question the Minister as to how much enforcement is taking place on this new law, especially when one considers the weather in Nova Scotia. Driving on a highway in foggy conditions and meeting vehicles without their headlights on is extremely dangerous for everyone, not just their headlights, but their rear lights as well. Mr. Speaker, we are pleased to see the partnership with Nova Scotia Road Builders Association. In fact, we applaud this effort as it echoes the legislation introduced by the member for Clare in May 2008. Bill number 150 was an amendment to the Motor Vehicle Act that requires a sign be posted in or approaching a temporary work area advising drivers that the fines for speeding in a temporary work area are double. We are pleased that the former Conservative government for passing this bill in May 2008, and I'm sure we've all seen the signs in construction areas as a result that promote safety for the workers and motorists and increases awareness on our roads. As well, Mr. Speaker, I want to commend the Minister for implementing more rumble strips along our roads, especially even throughout his own riding, where I travel on a regular basis. Those rumble strips are very effective, both in the summertime and especially in the wintertime when roads are covered and it's not always clear to see where the yellow line is. And I'd be remiss if I did not recognize my colleagues for Kings West, who has been a strong advocate for rumble strips and has brought forward legislation in this House to make that mandatory throughout our province. Mr. Speaker, we would like to take this opportunity to honour our police officers, firefighters, paramedics, and vehicle compliance officers as well. These first responders often put their own lives in danger to save the lives of others. A very selfless deed, and these people should be thanked for their commitment and dedication. Mr. Speaker, our caucus would like to reiterate some of the words of the Minister to drive safely in our province of Nova Scotia and to be very safe on our roads this summer and throughout the entire year. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. The honourable member for Inverness.
Speaker, I'd like to thank the Minister for providing a copy of his remarks in advance of today's proceedings. And it's my pleasure as well to get up to speak about Road Safety Week. Mr. Speaker, I think we've seen a shift in culture in this province. I know in the rural area I come from, there's lots of Gaelic, yes, and I think in a lot of areas in the province, particularly in rural areas of the province, the incidence of drinking and driving has decreased. I know they're still getting people every week because we see it in the papers, but I do believe there's been a cultural shift away from drinking and driving. And I know the Minister's mentioned some of the partners that he's been working with, and I know they do a lot of good advertising. And I think the message there, Mr. Speaker, that is given to the public is plan ahead. And if somebody is planning to go out and consume alcohol, plan ahead to make sure that there is a plan in place so that when you go to get home at the end of the night, there's a safe method to get there. And that's really the answer for that, Mr. Speaker. I also know texting, and I did some traveling in the southern U.S. recently, and I noticed people looking at their phones while they're driving. And I've noticed a cultural shift already in this province where we don't see that anymore, certainly not as much. And so, Mr. Speaker, I think that there's been a cultural shift move there. And I think that is a good thing. And I know here in the legislature, I think we know that our own Sergeant-at-Arms, Kenneth Greenham, keeps an eye on us, and maybe if Nova Scotians pictured him in their rearview mirror when they have their cell phone at hand, they might decide to put it back from whence they picked it up. So if we had the Sergeant-at-Arms with his mace in the back seat, that might be a good image for people to have in mind. So, Mr. Speaker, I know that this is also Motorcycle Safety Awareness Month, and as a motorcycle driver myself, I know the importance of safety. And I remember when I was taking my testing to get licensed, we were required to drive at a very slow speed and to navigate turns. And it certainly is much more difficult to drive a motorcycle at a slow speed than a fast speed. And I know the police officers here in Halifax, I was watching the news last night, they were actually doing their spring training to make sure they're ready for riding the big Harley Davidsons that they have. And so that testing is good practice, and I know motorcycle drivers around the province, most of them are responsible, most of them go through those tests, but it's certainly good to do a refresher now and again on our own. And so important for motorcyclists to be defensive drivers, because oftentimes motorists may not see motorcyclists on the road. And I know when I drive myself, I'm very careful. And if I see somebody who looks like they're going to pull out onto the road, I'll usually slow down and assume that they might just pull out onto the road. So, and I know slippery conditions. When it rains, it can be a very slippery time for motorcycles. And you don't know that until you start riding a motorcycle. And you learn that some of the oil and whatnot that's coming off vehicles and is being deposited on the road surface becomes very slippery at the start of a rain. And with a motorcycle, you don't have much contact with the road. So I'd like to also remind everybody that it is Motorcycle Safety Awareness Month, the month of May, and the importance of that. I want to say something else too, Mr. Speaker. I think pedestrians have a role to play in road safety. We must not only expect safety-minded actions from motorists, but also from pedestrians, because they share the road as well. And we must be careful never to assume that motorists are seeing pedestrians and whatnot as well. And it's important to be defensive about that. This is also North American Occupational Health and Safety Awareness Week, Mr. Speaker. And when I was in Port Hastings earlier this week at a flag raising for that, we talked about, I was actually telling them about a gentleman who I was working with on my motorcycle on the weekend, and we were talking about it, and he was telling me about a program that he went through. And there were 4 critical states of mind. It was a safety program from real-world application, and the 4 states of mind that can lead to critical errors and to injury, and I think they're very applicable for our roadways, Mr. Speaker. The 4 of them are frustration, fatigue, rushing, and complacency. And those are all things that can, of course, not just cause accidents in the workplace, but certainly on the highway. So, Mr. Speaker, I leave that as a point for members to think about and for the public to think about. And thank you for the opportunity to speak about this important week. Thank you.
Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as the Minister of Community Services and the Minister responsible for housing, it is my priority to make life better for Nova Scotians through safe and affordable housing. On Monday, our government announced the province's very first long-term housing strategy. It was an historic day and caused me to reflect on how central my grandparents' home has been throughout my life. Beginning as a young child visiting with my parents, continuing as a parent myself, raising a child in that same house, and providing the touchstone for my family's life today. I feel so fortunate to live in my grandparents' home with my family. I recognize how this enables my strong and continuing connection to my childhood community. Mr. Speaker, until now, Nova Scotia has been missing a blueprint to deal with the housing needs of Nova Scotians. Recently, we consulted and we listened to more than 500 Nova Scotians who shared their struggles as well as their suggestions openly. Our new housing strategy has been shaped by their voices, their needs, and their opinions. Mr. Speaker, I don't know why previous Liberal and Conservative governments have always operated without a clear plan to deal with this crucial issue, but those days are finally over. As a result of the leadership of our Premier, I am proud of the fact that Nova Scotia now has a long-term strategy to address the housing needs of our fellow Nova Scotians. As we heard many times during the public consultation, Nova Scotians want more access to homes that are affordable. That's why, Mr. Speaker, one of our top priorities will be to build more affordable homes and create home ownership opportunities. We will build diverse communities with smaller homes that reflect the current needs of Nova Scotia's families. We will support developments with a mix of income levels, housing types, and length of stay. Tenants will pay full market rent to live next door to homeowners with subsidized rent. Subsidized housing will be indistinguishable from market-priced homes. Mr. Speaker, we're excited about a number of immediate opportunities where we will showcase our mixed market approach. Some of the most promising include College Park in Windsor, Bloomfield in Halifax North End, and some neighbourhood revitalization initiatives in Sydney, Truro, and other areas. We heard over and over again about the importance of ensuring affordable housing choices for owners and renters. In the past, anyone who wanted to rent had to choose between fully subsidized rent or full market rent, with little or nothing in between. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to say that we will soon offer a full range of affordability options for tenants, offering full and partial support based on income. Mr. Speaker, the houses we build or finance will address an immediate critical need for more affordable housing for low-income families and individuals, as well as many middle-class Nova Scotians. During the consultations, we also heard that for many, once rent, groceries, and other necessities are paid for, there is little, if anything, left over. Mr. Speaker, saving money for a home can seem like a distant, if not impossible dream for many hardworking families. We will be there to help these people who need a hand up, not a handout. Nova Scotia will become a leader in innovative financial solutions to help Nova Scotians who may not yet be in a position to secure a mortgage from a bank or a credit union. We will enable Nova Scotians to save for a down payment, build equity, and buy their home. We will offer lease-to-own options, such as dedicating part of a tenant's rent to building equity in their home. And we will offer a graduate home ownership program that lets recent graduates get a jump start in building equity and provide an incentive to stay right here at home. Mr. Speaker, this is comprehensive housing strategy ensures that we take care of the generation that took care of us. We will look at new and improved programs for seniors to help them stay in their family homes as long as they can. Seniors, as well as people with disabilities, lend diversity and vitality to our communities, ensuring that they are able to live in the community was another key theme from the consultations. In fact, moving towards providing more options specifically for people with disabilities has been a key pillar for me. And the right housing options can support the goal of ensuring dignity and independence. Mr. Speaker, our government has made it clear that we want people with disabilities to be able to live in their communities with real opportunities for social inclusion. As we build more diverse housing, we will integrate supported and accessible units directly into these developments. And Mr. Speaker, this strategy will help our most vulnerable citizens. As I'm sure members of this House are aware, homelessness is a real problem that requires all levels of government and community partners to work together. We will adopt a housing-first approach that will help homeless people find a safe place to live and provide them quickly with the support they need. Mr. Speaker, the government cannot fulfill this ambitious strategy on its own. It will take the entire community working together. This includes all levels of government, the private sector, and non-profit organizations. We will also work closely with our municipal partners to make sure we integrate with their community planning and zoning strategies, and we will cooperate across government departments and agencies. Mr. Speaker, over the next 10 years, we will invest at least $500 million to help achieve our goal of building new, vibrant communities, revitalizing existing ones, and offering affordable new housing choices for Nova Scotia families. And that is in addition, I will say again, Mr. Speaker, that is in addition to our existing investments. Let me repeat, Mr. Speaker, we will invest $500 million more to create affordable homes and help Nova Scotians have better access to home ownership. We will do this by leveraging our Housing Corporation's working capital. This fund is currently used for a variety of development purposes. In the future, it will also be used to help finance developments of all kinds. Finally, Mr. Speaker, greater utilization of the Nova Scotia Housing Development Corporation will result in a housing strategy that works effectively and provides opportunities to bring forward housing solutions based on the specific needs of Nova Scotia communities. Nova Scotia needs a modern housing agency to meet the realities and challenges facing today's families and communities. That's why the Nova Scotia Housing Development Corporation will become Housing Nova Scotia and will be responsible for the implementation of this housing strategy. Mr. Speaker, I was happy to hear that my colleagues from the opposition parties are in agreement with the government's vision to address the housing challenges this province faces. I have also heard some criticism around the so-called lack of specific targets. This can only come from people who have actually failed to read the strategy. Mr. Speaker, it is not our intention to tell communities what they need. They will know what works best for them, and they will come forward with housing plans that meets their needs. Housing Nova Scotia will develop, with the assistance and guidance of a new advisory board, a solid business plan which will include specific targets. But anyone reading the strategy will actually see clearly identified targets that are in our action plan in the coming months. I also want to be clear that our strategy commits to the development of a clear and transparent accountability framework focused on measurable outcomes. The key, Mr. Speaker, will be the supply of more affordable housing options for Nova Scotians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I apologize in advance for my voice. I'm suffering from allergies. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to first of all thank all of those community members and housing advocates from across the province who have been working to ensure that Nova Scotians have safe and affordable housing. As well, I'd like to thank them for their advocacy work in bringing their issues and the issues of Nova Scotians facing housing crises to the forefront. I'd like to also thank the Minister's office for sending her remarks to my office in advance. Nova Scotians had high hopes for this strategy, and there are some good visions for the future of housing in it. We are pleased that the government has taken the idea from Liberal legislation tabled in the fall of 2012 and again earlier this session to create an advisory board for the Housing Corporation. We're also pleased that they are going to spend money from the deferred federal contribution of the Social Housing Agreement, something we've been asking them to do for quite some time. We applaud the government for recognizing the demographic challenges and working with builders to provide small options homes. Hundreds of people came out to consultations and made submissions for this strategy in the hopes that they would see real action from this government. And let's be clear, this isn't a strategy, it's a framework, it's a wish list. In fact, Mr. Speaker, this morning at Public Accounts, the minister's deputy referred to it as a starting point to rethinking housing, and that's all it is. It's being dropped in the laps of Nova Scotians on the eve of an election to make it look like this government has done something about the housing crisis. It's been 4 years, and they've built just 200 units. The minister says the houses they will build will address an immediate critical need for more affordable housing. There is nothing in this plan that calls for anything to be built immediately. This is a plan to plan some more. Meanwhile, 1,777 families are waiting for public housing. 2,518 seniors are on the wait list for public housing. 650 people are waiting for small options homes. Housing organizations are begging for more money, and this government has used this strategy to deny organizations like Morris House funding that would help them provide housing first. The community, I listened to the minister quietly while she made hers. I would appreciate the same opportunity here. The community organizations that devoted their time and their energy to the strategy have been excluded from this initiative. The NDP have turned their backs on the people who have done the lion's share of the work for many years. This minister states that the opposition parties have raised concerns about the lack of targets. We are not alone in this. The Nova Scotia League for Equal Opportunities expressed concern about the lack of targets, actions, and responsibilities this week at Community Services Committee. The Affordable Housing Association of Nova Scotia has also expressed concern about the lack of targets. Again, this framework is an election document. If it were an actual call to action, it would have included things like targets, timelines, responsibilities. Those do not exist in this document. Last election, the NDP promised to end emergency room closures. Last year, they were closed for 17,000 hours. They promised not to raise taxes. Instead, they raised the HST by 2% and increased 1,400 user fees twice. They promised to cut the provincial portion of the HST on electrical bills, and then they added the efficiency tax. They cut funding to public education and universities. There was no mention of that in their election promises. They doled out over $500 million in corporate welfare. That wasn't in their election document. Given this government's track record, we can see why community and social justice advocates are skeptical of this plan. Paul O'Hara is quoted in a Media Co-op article today stating, "The strategy is very non-committal on specific action. They are still talking and not doing, and by now it is 4 years on in their mandate." End quote. And I'll table that article. It's been 4 years, and this government is still talking. This is not the NDP people thought they elected. Nova Scotians are tired of talk.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I too would like to thank the Minister for providing us with an advance copy of her statement today. You know, Mr. Speaker, it goes without saying that every member of this House would agree that all Nova Scotians deserve to have access to safe and affordable housing. We know how important it is to have a place to call home. Though we welcome the Minister's announcements of a housing strategy, it's lacking in details. It's unclear what the finished product will look like, or when Nova Scotians can expect certain projects to be completed or certain programs to be available. The biggest missing piece, Mr. Speaker, is the lack of a plan to pay for this. A program of this size with a $500 million budget needs to be accompanied by a clearly defined plan to pay for it. The government has no plans to grow the economy, and unemployment levels across the province are staggering. There appears to be no plan to turn that around to bring in the revenue to pay for this housing strategy. The Minister mentioned in her remarks today that Nova Scotians told her that their personal budgets were stretched too thin. After paying their rent, buying groceries, and paying bills, they have little, if anything, left over. That's something, Mr. Speaker, that this government would do well to address. Affordable housing is essential, but something the government needs to understand is that the issue of poverty is multifaceted. We cannot point to one single cause or one single solution. By making life unaffordable through high taxes, high power rates, and stagnant wage growth, Nova Scotians are struggling to keep their heads above water. The need for affordable housing has grown because of financial stress that the government has put on the people of this province. The government should have coupled this housing strategy with a plan for job creation, a plan that will put the right conditions in place for Nova Scotia's economy to prosper. By failing to do that, Mr. Speaker, they've only guaranteed Nova Scotians that struggle to pay bills, maintain a home, and keep a job will continue. Though we're pleased that more families will have access to safe and affordable housing, we're worried that our economy will not turn around and that the need will grow even more. The housing strategy does not contain the specifics that Nova Scotians were looking for. It's very difficult to envision what will be done in each community when the government has not made up their minds. In the strategy itself, it says, some of the programs we are considering. How are Nova Scotians to understand the strategy if the department hasn't even made up their mind? The consultation process should have included discussions about these programs so that the government could present specifics. We could wait years to see these programs, Mr. Speaker, whichever ones they choose. So the bottom line is this, Mr. Speaker. We're happy to see that safe and affordable housing will be coming to more people in this province. However, it is disappointing to see no accompanying plan to pay for it or a plan to turn the economy around and break down the barriers and financial pressures put on Nova Scotians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Introduction of government notices of motion. The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Am I able to do an introduction?
Oh, certainly.
Thank you. I'd like to draw members' attention to the East Gallery. With us is a group who came together to plan an educational and emotionally fulfilling opportunity for women of all ages. And these are women who belong to the Women's Wellbeing Association, which has turned this gathering into a weekend-long conference-style expo promoting health and well-being for women in HRM and beyond. So with us, and I'd ask them to rise, is Kathleen Leedon, Kathy McPherson, Kathy Burgess, Julia McPherson, Rhonda Baxter, and someone who's unable to be with us is Shelley Arsenault. So I wish all members to give them a warm welcome.
Honourable, we welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoy this afternoon's proceedings. I will now recognize the Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas from May 24th to 26th at Cole Harbour Place in Dartmouth, the first annual Women's Health Expo will take place. And whereas the Expo will bring together healthcare providers, researchers, and specialists in the areas of financial, social, physical, and spiritual wellness, among other exhibitors. And whereas the Expo could not be made possible without community support, the effort of volunteers, and the sponsors who promote all aspects of the importance of women's health. Therefore, be it resolved that all the members of this House of Assembly recognize the importance of women's health and provide their support to the first annual Women's Wellbeing Expo. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I too beg leave to make an introduction.
Most certainly.
I'd like to draw the attention of the members of the House to the East Gallery. It is my great pleasure to introduce Ken McKinnon, the Chair of the Nova Scotia Cooperative Council's Board of Directors. Ken McKinnon has been involved with the Nova Scotia Cooperative Council for the past 4 years and has served as the board chair for the last 3 years. He has worked as a commercial banker in the financial industry for the past 16 years and lives in Badek with his family. Ken is here representing the Nova Scotia Cooperative Council, which many of members of the House are very familiar with. Mr. Speaker, I would ask members of the House to give Mr. McKinnon a warm welcome.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoy this afternoon's proceedings. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Nova Scotia Cooperative Council helps the economic and social well-being in every region of our province, and whereas the province and the Cooperative Council have worked together for 10 years on the Credit Union Small Business Loan Guarantee, which has helped more than 1,100 small businesses, resulting in more than 2,000 jobs created and 5,000 jobs maintained. Whereas the Council recently won 3 Progress Innovation Awards in the categories of Economic and Community Development, Social Enterprise, and overall Economics and Community Development. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize and celebrate the accomplishments of the Nova Scotia Cooperative Council and the credit unions of Nova Scotia, and the work that they do in creating sustainable and innovative small business and communities. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas CSS Acadia, the largest artifact at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, was launched 100 years ago today, May the 8th, in Newcastle, England, as a Canadian hydrographic survey vessel, and whereas the CSS Acadia worked for 56 years as a survey and research ship and is the only vessel still in existence that served Canada in both World Wars, and whereas this summer, Nova Scotians will have an opportunity to experience the work and mystique of the CSS Acadia with celebrations that include an exhibit and talks at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic and a reunion for former crew members. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly thank the CSS Acadia's former crew members, staff at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, and all of our partners who have helped share the vessel's tremendous story, and wish them great success with the 100th anniversary celebrations. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to make an introduction.
Most certainly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I draw members' attention to the East Gallery, where I'll ask our guests to rise. Joining us today is Joni Mitchell, the Director of Development for the Arthritis Society Atlantic Region, and Aaron DeBott, a Joints in Motion participant who recently returned from the Rome Joints in Motion Marathon. And I ask all members to give them a warm welcome.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Joints in Motion is a successful fundraising event for the Arthritis Society, with Nova Scotians participating in various marathons around the world, and whereas 1 in 4 Nova Scotians are living with arthritis, and whereas the Joints in Motion training team has raised more than $135,000 for the Arthritis Society. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate the Joints in Motion staff, volunteers, and participants on raising a tremendous amount of funds to help Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I ask for a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas since 1982, Anne Rapson, an accomplished violinist, has served as Associate Concertmaster for Symphony Nova Scotia, building on a lifelong love of music to strengthen the leading orchestra in Atlantic Canada as it delivers top-notch classical and popular musical performances. And whereas John Rapson has served as Principal Clarinetist for Symphony Nova Scotia and has won several prestigious Canadian and international music competitions during his career, including the CBC Talent Festival, the Canadian Centenary Festival of Music, and the bronze medal at the Geneva International Clarinet Competition. And whereas Anne and John Rapson will be retiring from their roles at Symphony Nova Scotia after having built successful careers as performers and contributing to making the orchestra a world-class arts and culture institution. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House of Assembly congratulate Anne and John Rapson on their successful careers, thank them for their tremendous contributions to Symphony Nova Scotia, and wish them good health and much happiness in their retirement. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. Notices of motion. The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Mr. Benjamin L. McLean, formerly of Hubbard's, Nova Scotia, and now working with the Canadian Embassy in Berlin, Germany, working with the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, was recently awarded the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Award. And whereas since graduating from Forest Heights Community School, Mr. McLean has pursued a career which has taken him to Haiti and Brussels and the ability to study in New Zealand. And whereas the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade chose Mr. McLean to thank him for his exceptional work and professionalism during the 2011 Egyptian evacuations and temporary assignment in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, but also for his work as Berlin's consular head. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Benjamin McLean on receiving the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal and wish him continued success as he continues with a very successful career. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Yarmouth on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to bring the House of Assembly's attention to the East Gallery, the West Gallery. We have one of my many favorite constituents in the gallery with us today, John McDonald, who used to take care of my money, actually, at the Bank of Montreal in Yarmouth, and who informed me that he's here today to ensure that I behave myself in the legislature. But if I could ask John to stand up and receive the warm welcome of the House, that'd be great. Thank you so much.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day. I will move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas today marks 68 years since the Allied victory brought the Second World War in Europe to an end, otherwise known as VE Day. And whereas after more than 5 long years of unprecedented human suffering and nearly a year after the largest land invasion in history, the people of Europe could start to rebuild their lives and communities. And whereas for Canadians, today reminds us of the vital role our armed forces played in liberating countries across Europe, including Holland, Italy, and France, and the ultimate sacrifice made by 45,400 Canadian heroes. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House reflect on the end of the most deadly military conflict in history and the role thousands of Canadians played in bringing that awful conflict to an end. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister, the Premier.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Cole Harbour Pee Wee B boys and Bantam AA female hockey teams co-hosted this year's provincial championship in Cole Harbour. And whereas thanks to the support of volunteers and parents, it was the first time Cole Harbour had been selected to host this event. And whereas both teams played hard, with the Pee Wee boys winning the bronze medal and the Bantam girls team finishing second and bringing home the silver medal, therefore be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly join together in congratulating the members of both teams for their hard work and commitment to their respective teams, and thank the many volunteers who made the event possible. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the under-14 volleyball provincials were held at the Canada Games Centre in Halifax over the weekend of April 20th and 21st, and whereas the Fusion Muse team from the Yarmouth Southwest Fusion Volleyball Club was among 29 teams competing in Tiers 1 and 2, and whereas the Fusion Muse team consisting of Sophie Surratt, Julie Phillips, Kaylee Amiro, Madison Burbage, Renee Cleveland, Maggie O'Brien, Sydney Dion, Christine Babin, Caitlin Mooney, Bailey Gushu, and Riley Mosley, under the guidance of coaches Ricky Muse and Jacinda Amiro, won the gold medal game in this tournament. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate Fusion Muse on becoming provincial champions at the Under-14 Volleyball Provincials and wish them every future success in the sport of volleyball. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the municipality of the District of Argyll held a special by-election on Saturday, April 27, 2013, and whereas Nicole Albright, a teacher from Belleville, won the by-election for District 5. And whereas Nicole Albright's late father, Arthur Muse, served several terms on council for the same district starting in 1988 until his death in 2008. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Councillor Albright on winning this by-election and wish her success in her new role as the newly elected councillor. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in 2004, Fred Connors and Joel Fulwelling opened Fred, consisting of a salon, the wonderful Wet Cafe, and an art gallery, all located at Agricola and North Streets in Halifax's North End. And whereas Fred Connors and Joel Fulwelling are well known for their active support of many arts and cultural organizations in Halifax and for their support of advocacy and outreach groups including Family SOS, Leave Out Violence Everywhere, Stepping Stone, and Lang House. And whereas the Cafe and Gallery at Fred have hosted exhibitions of contemporary art by many local artists with a special emphasis on challenging work by young, emerging artists, and have been the venue for many special events and celebrations such as Lang House's recent Splash of Spring fundraiser. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly express their thanks to Fred Connors and Joel Fulwelling for their ongoing efforts to expand and enhance Halifax's cultural landscape and to help make Halifax a better place to live for all its residents, and hope that Fred and Joel will continue their efforts for many years to come. And Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Inverness.
Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in 1983, L'Arche Cape Breton was founded by Tom and Ann Gunn when they invited Janet Moore to come and live with their family. And whereas for 3 days at the end of April, the community of L'Arche Cape Breton celebrated its 30th anniversary with a variety concert, anniversary dinner, a humdinger of a dance, and a service at the community chapel. And whereas L'Arche Cape Breton has impacted people's lives, those with developmental disabilities, and those who choose to share life with them. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly recognize L'Arche Cape Breton for creating, growing, and sustaining a community where all are welcomed, accepted, and celebrated. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Truro Bible Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Jacob Works of Truro is one of 120 youth chosen from over 500 worldwide submissions to attend the prestigious 4-H Youth Ag Summit in Calgary in August. And whereas the Feeding a Hungry Planet 4-H Youth Ag Summit tasks participants to discuss challenges of feeding a growing global population and identify agricultural sustainable solutions to these challenges. And whereas the summit is part of 4-H Canada's 100th anniversary celebrations and offers youth an exciting opportunity to make a lasting contribution to agriculture worldwide. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature applauds Jacob Works for his outstanding achievement and wishes him enjoyment and success in Calgary this August. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Bria Ross organized a 30-hour famine at Calvary Baptist Church in North Sydney with 10 of her friends in order to bring awareness to countries where people go without food for much or longer periods of time. And whereas this World Vision program takes place around the world every year to educate people about hunger and to raise funds to help the hungry. Whereas the 30-hour famine, Bria and her friends helped to make people in their community more aware of the plight of people dealing with hunger locally and abroad. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly salute Ms. Ross and her friends for their compassion and leadership in the fight against world hunger. And, Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Excuse me. Whereas Seaside FM, a not-for-profit radio station in Eastern Passage, is now in its 11th year on the air. And whereas Seaside's annual radiothon, held in March of this year, raised $52,300 from 1,123 donors for its continuing operations, which is a new record. And whereas 1,742 Seaside FM teddy bears were given out for donations over $25, and 1,354 of these were redonated by recipients to local charities, including shelters and the IWK. Therefore, be it resolved that this Nova Scotia House of Assembly congratulates Seaside FM and its staff for recording a record-breaking radiothon and wishes them all the best for another successful broadcasting year. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas last year, in 1 month alone, 23,561 Nova Scotians were assisted by food banks. And whereas almost 1/3 of Nova Scotians accessing food bank services were under the age of 18. And whereas the member from Kings West and I, along with other MLAs, are participating in Feed Nova Scotia Hunger Awareness Week and are fasting until tomorrow morning to help bring attention to the challenges that many families face with hunger and poverty in our communities. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly recognize that today, although members of this House are choosing to fast, many Nova Scotians are unfortunately unable to make that choice. We must continue to fight hunger on their behalf and improve services for those in need. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas today was the Heart and Stroke Foundation's annual walkabout event, and whereas 159 walks were organized across the province and drew 1,475 walkers out to raise awareness about the benefits of walking for good health. And whereas the goal of today's event is to create a culture of walking in Nova Scotia and to remind people of the mental, physical, and environmental benefits it has. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly thank those who organized and took part in today's walkabout event and encourage Nova Scotians to choose walking for their health and their environment. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution, a future day. Whereas the month of April was Autism Awareness Month, and whereas Ethan Ringer, a grade 3 student at Dr. John C. Wickwire Academy in Liverpool, has created a PowerPoint presentation explaining what autism is and how it affects him as an individual who has autism. And whereas Ethan Ringer has posted this PowerPoint presentation on the internet, where it reached more than 2,000 viewers during the first week it was made available, effectively spreading awareness of autism in the words of one who lives with it daily. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly recognizes and congratulates Ethan Ringer of Liverpool for sharing his experience and spreading awareness of autism. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I will move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas May 6th to 10th is Hunger Awareness Week and an opportunity for Canadians to acknowledge that hunger exists in our communities. Whereas the number of Nova Scotians relying on food banks and food support continues to grow. Whereas Feed Nova Scotia helps feed hungry people by collecting and distributing food to more than 150 member agency food banks and meal programs, while working tirelessly to eliminate chronic hunger and poverty through research, awareness, and support programs. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this legislature commend Feed Nova Scotia Executive Director Diane Swinimer and everyone at Feed Nova Scotia for their commitment to ending hunger in our province and wish them success during Hunger Awareness Week activities. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Liberal Energy Plan is based on inaccurate, incomplete, and erroneous information, and whereas the Leader of the Liberal Party said in October 2012 that, quote, there are other options. As a matter of fact, we talked about allowing competition in a highly regulated environment. The province of New Brunswick actually does that now, unquote. And whereas the Leader of the Opposition has been proven wrong with New Brunswick government's announcement yesterday that an open market in their province has failed, just as it has in several other provinces and states. Therefore, be it resolved that the Liberal Party admit that it's time to unplug their energy plan and embrace the NDP's local sustainable energy plan that is providing fairer rates for Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 14-year-old Colin Pickles of Coxheath has developed a computer program called Your Privacy that scans social media and websites looking for threatening or insulting words and helps delete them. And whereas Colin said the tragic suicide of British Columbia teen Amanda Todd inspired him to create the program. And whereas Colin is also working on a mobile app that will filter text messages in the same way his full program filters social media. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly salute Colin Pickles for his efforts to do something positive about cyberbullying and its impacts. And, Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Amherst Regional High School is known not only for its great teachers and students, but also for its sports teams and coaches. And whereas as head coach of the ARHS basketball team, Matt Gamblin and his assistants have been important to the success of the Viking basketball program. And whereas nearby Mount Allison University has recently recognized the excellence right there in their own backyard when it appointed Matt Gamblin as head coach of the Mounties women's basketball team. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly join me in congratulating Coach Matt Gamblin and his assistants and wish them the best of luck in the future. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The MLA for Kings North. Honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Rick Weisner of Canning, who both in his volunteer life as fire chief for the Canning and District Volunteer Fire Department and in his professional life as a driver for Olton Fuels, shows his concern for the safety and well-being of those in his community. And whereas Rick Weisner was recently recognized for his outstanding contributions to safety excellence by being awarded the Steve Bennett Memorial Safety Award Professional Driver by the Nova Scotia Trucking Safety Association, and whereas this award acknowledges Rick Weisner's outstanding performance in the area of safety and risk management, as well as his contributions to safety in his community, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Rick Weisner for receiving the Steve Bennett Memorial Safety Award Professional Driver for 2013 and thank him for the care and dedication to safety he demonstrates every day in his community. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Guysborough Sheet Harbour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on December 5th, 2012, the representatives from the Rainbow Food Bank visited the Sheet Harbour Consolidated School. And whereas the grade 4 students had been learning about how compassionate it is to give donations of food, clothing, and shelter to those who need assistance.
Becky.
And whereas the students presented the local food bank with a donation of 4 boxes of food. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate the grade 4 students at the Sheet Harbour Consolidated School on their generosity, kindness, and dedication to their community. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Lunenburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Liberal caucus has cobbled together an energy plan that has more holes in it than the California power grid after they deregulated their market, and whereas the leader of the Liberal Party has repeatedly defended a plan that would cause significant chaos in our electricity market and result in increases of 30 to 50%, and whereas the leader has admitted several times in interviews that it would be difficult to say how opening up the electricity market would help reduce power bills. Therefore, be it resolved that the leader of the official opposition and the Liberal caucus explain why they have chosen cheap politics over good policy and continuously mislead Nova Scotians in their reckless energy plan. Mr. Speaker, I require waiver of notice.
I cannot hear the member reading the resolution with the chatter in the chamber today. So I'd mind if you want to take those conversations outside, I'd greatly appreciate it. Now I'll recognize the honourable member for Lunenburg to start over again so I can hear the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Liberal caucus has cobbled together an energy plan that has more holes in it than the California power grid after they deregulated the market, and whereas the leader of the Liberal Party has repeatedly defended a plan that would cause significant chaos in our electricity market and result in rate increases of 30 to 50%, and whereas the leader has even admitted in several interviews that it would be difficult to say how opening up the electricity market would help reduce power bills. Therefore, be it resolved that the official leader of the opposition and the Liberal caucus explain why they have chosen cheap politics over good policy and continuously mislead Nova Scotians with their reckless energy plan. Madam Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. Recognize the honourable member for Colchester Musquodoboit Valley.
Madam Speaker, I present this resolution on behalf of the member for Cape Breton Nova. Whereas on May 22, 2013, Carol Beaton, Executive Director of the Cape Breton Centre for Craft and Design, will be inducted into the Cape Breton Business Hall of Fame. And whereas after 14 years of dedicated service, Carol Beaton will be retiring at the end of June 2013.
And whereas through Carol Beaton's guidance, the Cape Breton Centre for Craft and Design has become a leader in the development of the craft industry on the island, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House join me in wishing Carol all the best in her retirement and thank her for her dedication and commitment to the craft world. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Those opposed, nay. The motion is carried. Now recognize the honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas for 5 years, the Premier used taxpayers' dollars in order to pay his own barrister fees. And whereas this use of taxpayers' dollars by the Premier amounted to $10,642.67 of taxpayers' money that the Premier could retain his own status. Whereas the Premier kept using taxpayers' money to pay his barrister fees and retain his status until such time as he was discovered and eventually racking up $10,642.67 in fees, which were benefits to the Premier. Therefore, be resolved, the Premier did use thousands of dollars out of the pockets of taxpayers over the course of many years in order that the Premier could retain his own status, and the member for Halifax-Chebucto urged the Premier to apologize to all Nova Scotians for using their money for his own advantage. Madam Speaker, I'd ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. Recognize the honourable member for Guysborough, Sheet Harbour.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the province of New Brunswick has repealed their failed deregulated system and is returning to a regulated market because it will bring low and stable electricity rates, energy security, reliability of the electrical system, and environmental responsibility. And whereas the savings from reintegration of NB Power for New Brunswick taxpayers is estimated to be in the millions of dollars. And whereas the Liberal caucus has misguidedly continued down the deregulation path based on New Brunswick's model, despite the fact that the New Brunswick government stated in 2011 that an open market has not worked in their province. Therefore, be it resolved that the official leader of the opposition and the Liberal caucus admit their energy plan is a failure and support the NDP's plan that is successfully providing local, green, efficient, tax-free energy across Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. Now recognize the honourable member for Richmond.
Madam Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Monday, May 6, marked the opening of Martel's PharmaChoice, a full-service pharmacy in Arishat. Whereas 2009 Dalhousie University pharmacy graduate Tracy Martel and her husband Jason have decided to open the pharmacy as they set their roots down in their home community of Ilmadam. And whereas with 4 employees, Martel's PharmaChoice will offer refill reminder programs, medication reviews, blister packing, patient counseling, and will be available for after-hours emergencies. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of the House of Assembly join me in congratulating pharmacist Tracy Martel and her husband Jason Martel on the opening of Martel's PharmaChoice and wish them and their staff great success. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the objective of the Community Volunteer Income Tax Program is to help eligible individuals who are not able to prepare their income tax and benefit returns by themselves. And whereas Spitiggraw resident Joan Clennon, an employee of Development Ilmadam Association and volunteer with several organizations, has been giving her time to help residents complete their income tax and benefit returns for the past number of years. And whereas for the 2012 taxation year, Joan has completed 120 income tax and benefit returns for seniors and other residents who cannot afford to pay for the service. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of the House of Assembly recognize the efforts of Joan Clennon as a volunteer with the Community Volunteer Income Tax Program and thank her for giving freely of her time to assist members of her community. And Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Truro Bible Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Ontario government stated in 2010 that, quote, a brief market deregulation scheme saw electricity prices spike an average of over 30% in just 7 months. And whereas in Alberta, RBC Dominion Securities I'm going to wait till there's quiet, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. That's twice today. I played a lot of ball and 3 strikes and you're out in my game, so I'm going to remind the honourable members that let them read their resolutions and stop the heckling. The honourable member for Truro Bible Hill.
And whereas in Alberta, RBC Dominion Securities stated in 2001 that, quote, in unnerving similarity to California's experience, this process, deregulation, has resulted in Alberta's power prices increasing from amongst the lowest in the world to amongst the highest prices in North America. And whereas the province of New Brunswick has said that, quote, the competitive market has not developed in New Brunswick as anticipated, and given what has occurred in British Columbia, Ontario, and elsewhere, where competitive electricity markets have also failed to thrive, there is a likelihood that it will happen, unquote. Therefore, be it resolved that the Leader of the Official Opposition explain immediately to Nova Scotians why he has been ignoring the facts for so long and has continued to advocate for an energy plan that has failed time and time again. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas for 5 years the Premier used taxpayers' dollars in order to pay for his own barrister fees. And whereas this use of taxpayers' money by the Premier amounted to over $10,642.67 of taxpayers' money so that the Premier could retain his own status. And whereas the Premier kept using taxpayers' money to pay his barrister fees and retain his status until such a time as he was discovered, eventually racking up $10,642.67 in fees, which benefited the Premier. Therefore, be it resolved that the Premier did use thousands of dollars out of the pockets of taxpayers over the course of many years in order that the Premier could retain his own status, and that the member for Truro Bible Hill urged the Premier to apologize to all Nova Scotians for using their money for his advantage. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Government of New Brunswick admitted yesterday that deregulation of their electricity market has been a massive failure, costing millions of additional dollars. And whereas the woefully misinformed Leader of the Official Opposition pointed out just a few short months ago that he thought New Brunswick deregulation plan was the answer to Nova Scotia's electricity needs. And whereas the New Brunswick government stated that the competitive market has not developed in New Brunswick as anticipated. And given what has occurred in British Columbia, Ontario, and elsewhere, where competitive electricity markets have also failed to thrive, there's little likelihood that that will happen. Therefore, be it resolved that the Liberal caucus explain why they think such a failed and costly plan would be good for Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? No. I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the The official leader of the opposition has stood by his baseless and reckless energy plan for Nova Scotia. And whereas the Liberal caucus has continued to champion a plan to deregulate electricity in Nova Scotia, despite the fact that it has failed in Ontario, Alberta, California, and now right next door in New Brunswick. And whereas the leader of the Liberal Party has never been able to explain how his plan would bring cheaper or more stable rates to this province, and has admitted that it probably won't, therefore be it resolved that the Liberal leader gives serious thought to flipping the switch on his failed energy plan and instead support the NDP's plan that is working right now for Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. It agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Lunenburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas it is the responsibility of members of the legislature, regardless of political party, to work to improve Nova Scotia's confidence in our political system. And whereas the legislature has not received an update on the disposition of the $2.2 million from the Liberals' segregated funds since the 2009 legislation was passed, it is important for all members to be better informed on this issue, and whereas the creation of the Alan J. McEachern Institute is of interest to all members of this House of Assembly, given that stated focus on public policy matters, therefore be it resolved that the Leader of the Opposition table with the Clerk of the House of Assembly on or before May 17, 2013, all trust documents, names of trustees, financial statements, and all other relevant documentation related to the For the Good Public Trust and the Alan J. McEachern Institute. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. It agreed? I hear a no. There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against. Recorded vote. Recorded vote has been called for. We shall ring the bells for 1 hour or until the whips are satisfied. Order, please. The whips are satisfied now for a recorded vote, and I shall read. Therefore, be it resolved that the Leader of the Opposition table with the Clerk of the House of Assembly on or before May 17, 2013, all trust documents, the names of the trustees, financial statements, and all other relevant documentation related to For the Public Good Trust and the Alan J. McEachern Institute. I will now ask the clerks to take the vote.
Mr. Landry.
Yes.
Ms. Moore.
Yes.
Mr. Smith.
Yes.
Ms. Peterson-Rayfuse.
Yes.
Mr. Corbett.
Yes.
Mr. Dexter. Ms. Maureen McDonald.
Yes.
Mr. Wilson.
Yes.
Mr. Paris.
Yes.
Ms. Jennings.
Yes.
Mr. McDonnell.
Yes.
Mr. Beliveau.
Yes.
Mr. Boudreau.
Yes.
Ms. Zan.
Yes.
Ms. Kent.
Yes.
Ms. Conrad.
Yes.
Mr. Pereira.
Yes.
Mr. Parker.
Yes.
Mr. McKinnon. Is absent. Ms. Raymond.
Yes.
Mr. Steele. Absent. Mr. Epstein.
Aye.
Mr. Estabrooks. He's absent. Mr. Press.
Yes.
Mr. Ramey.
Yes.
Mr. Scabar.
Yes.
Mr. Wynot.
Yes.
Mr. Morton.
Yes.
Ms. Birdsall.
Yes.
Mr. Burrow. Mr. Manning McDonald.
Yes.
Mr. Gaudette. Mr. Glavine.
Yes.
Ms. Whalen.
Yes.
Mr. McNeil.
Yes.
Mr. Sampson.
Oui.
Mr. D'Entremont,
Oui.
Mr. Bailey,
Yes.
Mr. Bain,
Yes.
Mr. Porter, absent. Mr. McMaster,
Yes.
Mr. McLeod, Mr. Oral,
Yes.
Mr. Younger, Ms. Reagan, she absent too. Ms. Casey,
Yes.
Mr. Caldwell,
Yes.
Mr. Zink,
Yes.
Mr. Terrio,
Yes.
Mr. McClellan,
Yes.
Mr. Churchill.
Yes.
Those in favor, 43. Those opposed, 0.
Motion is carried. The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas for 5 years the Premier's used tax dollars in order to pay for his own barrister fees. And whereas this use of taxpayers' money by the Premier amounted to $10,642.67 of taxpayers' money so that the Premier could retain his own status. And whereas the Premier kept using taxpayers' money to pay his barrister fees and retain his status until such time as he was discovered, eventually racking up $10,642.67 in fees, which benefited the Premier. Therefore, be it resolved, the Premier did use thousands of dollars out of the pockets of taxpayers over the course of many years in order so that the Premier could retain his own status, and the member for Kings North urged the Premier to apologize to all Nova Scotians for using their money for his advantage. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. Orders of the day, oral questions put by members to ministers. The time now is 3:39. We will finish at 5:09. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, sadly, for the past 4 years, the Premier has consistently put the interests of the NDP ahead of Nova Scotians by wastefully spending millions of taxpayer dollars on political advertising. Recently, more than $1.1 million has been spent to promote the NDP political advertising campaigns. The Premier has become so out of touch with Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, he's chosen political message over conducting 110 knee surgery replacements, 91 hip surgery replacements, hiring new nurses or doctors, Mr. Speaker. So my question, could the Premier please explain to the people of this province why his NDP political message are more important than the health care for our citizens?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure to the chagrin of the Leader of the Opposition, the reality is that the advertising we do is aimed directly at informing Nova Scotians as to the services that they can receive from government offices, Mr. Speaker. They, whether it happens to be services like telehealth, like the 811 service, whether it's the use of the collaborative emergency centres in order to get the care that they need in the communities they have, Mr. Speaker, it is advantageous to the people of Nova Scotia to know that they can get better care sooner.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Yeah, they're still trying to find out where, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this Premier doesn't respect Nova Scotians or their hard-earned money. His government continues to spend wastefully at the expense of seniors waiting for surgeries, homeowners struggling with heating costs, or, Mr. Speaker, children who are faced to deal with the burden of the NDP education cuts. Mr. Speaker, a federal NDP member of the Parliament has criticized the federal Conservative Party for their political advertising and went so far as to suggest that the federal Conservative Party repay the taxpayers of Canada. So my question to the Premier, will the Premier commit to identifying all the advertisements that are partisan and political in nature and direct the NDP party to give the money back to the people of Nova Scotia?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can commit to do that because there are none. It's all of the advertising that we do through the departments is aimed at ensuring that people understand the services that they get, in fact, that the government is dedicated to ensuring that no matter where you live in the province, no matter what your income level is, you are entitled to the best possible service, and this is particularly true in our education system, where it is this government that puts kids and learning first.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Emera and Nova Scotia Power released their first quarter 2013 profit results yesterday. Under the NDP's so-called rate stabilization plan, Emera's profits are up 41% to $115 million. Nova Scotia Power's profits are up 6% to $63 million. Under the NDP, Mr. Speaker, Emera has been helped by special NDP legislation to force the UARB to approve the Maritime Link within 6 months. They gave approval to Nova Scotia Power to go ahead with the Maritime Link even before UARB approval, and the NDP continues to support their guaranteed return on their profits, Mr. Speaker. So I'll ask the Premier, why has the NDP gone so far out of its way to guarantee such a huge financial windfall to Emera when so many Nova Scotians are struggling to pay their power bills?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I know that every time the Leader of the Conservative Party stands up and tries to ask a question like that, which is dripping with irony, and you must leave a vacant space in them, Mr. Speaker, because, of course, it is the Conservative Party that privatized Nova Scotia Power. It is the Conservative Party that for 10 years continued to propagate the conditions under which the increases in power which we've seen in this province have continued to perpetuate. It was they that tied us, along with the Liberals, to be fair, to the fossil fuel markets, which guaranteed the increases that we see. It is this government, Mr. Speaker, that is trying to ensure that Nova Scotians get the fairest possible rates, Mr. Speaker. It is us who are trying to ensure that the politics is taken out of power and we allow the best possible rates for consumers.
Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
That's pretty funny.
Mr. Speaker, the only irony here is that the Premier tells Nova Scotians they have turned the corner, but the only ones that have turned the corner in a good way are the shareholders of Emera under his government. That is the sad irony that Nova Scotians see today. While Emera's earnings grew by 41%, no other Nova Scotian has enjoyed such success under the NDP. In fact, average weekly earnings for everyone else have flatlined, growing 1 full percentage point less than the Canadian average, while Emera's earnings go up by 41% and Nova Scotia Power's by 6%. My question to the Premier is, why does he guarantee growing profits for Emera while standing idly by while average Nova Scotia earnings stagnate?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the opposite is actually true. The reality is that the increases in power that we see are related directly to the Conservative economic policy that was there for a decade. We're changing that policy, but you know, the electricity grid, the generation that we have in this province is what it is when you come into power, and it takes time for us to be able to rebuild that kind of an energy supply. That's why we need initiatives like Muskrat Falls. It is the Conservative energy policy which led to the increases you see. It is the policy of this government that led to the immediate 10% decline in power rates when we took the HST off of home energy.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it didn't take much time for the NDP to come in and jack up our power rates by over 30%. It didn't take much time for the NDP to come in and Emera's profits to grow by 41%. But the Premier tells Nova Scotians it's going to take time to deal with their needs, Mr. Speaker, which includes jobs and growing earnings and a cheaper electricity. But for that, the Premier tells them it's going to take time. Mr. Speaker, the Premier managed to create the ideal conditions for Emera and Nova Scotia Power for their earnings to grow, but not for anyone else. He sanctioned the Maritime Links project. He allowed them to go ahead without waiting for UARB approval, the one place Nova Scotians look to get a true independent analysis of the project. So I'll ask the Premier, why did he allow Emera to go ahead with the Maritime Links project instead of finding the true lowest cost alternative for Nova Scotians, the ones who pay the bills?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, of course, Maritime Link is the lowest cost option. That is being proven over and over again before the Utility and Review Board and is, I think, evident to most people who have looked at this. Mr. Speaker, but there is another irony in the question posed by the Leader of the Conservative Party, and it is simply this. As I understand it, and as was reported in the news, the increase in profits for Emera was tied to the fact that they were reselling the very volatile natural gas product that it had. And so the skyrocketing price of natural gas actually led to an increase in their profits. And you see, Mr. Speaker, this is exactly the kind of energy policy that the Leader of the Conservative Party would like to pursue, to handcuff us to those kinds of energy fuels that see these massive spikes and then make all of the consumers of Nova Scotia hostile to those hostage to those markets.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday we learned that Nova Scotia Power's parent company first quarter profits soared to 53%. Mr. Speaker, this company's profits continue to surge under the NDP government's failed energy policies. Policies that include a new deal for the Maritime Link, a deal that will bind Nova Scotians to rate increases over the next 35 years. So my question to the Premier, why is the Premier so satisfied to allow Nova Scotia Power and Emera to expand their energy monopoly on the backs of Nova Scotia ratepayers?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the energy policy of the province is to pursue a number of different kinds of initiatives in order to make sure that consumers in this province get the lowest and fairest rates. We want a proper energy efficiency program that will allow people to cut their consumption and therefore bring the actual cost of their energy down. It's to get off of fossil fuels, not only because they cause greenhouse gas emissions, but also because they are extremely volatile. And we have seen over the last number of years that because of Liberal and Conservative energy policy, we have faced these spikes in the cost of electricity. And instead, move to energy sources that have stable, long-term cost curves that allow us to be able to predictably predict what the cost will be in the years out ahead. This is good energy policy. This is reliable energy policy. This is secure energy policy, Mr. Speaker, and that's what we are pursuing.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, one thing we know, it's good for Emera, Mr. Speaker. Many Nova Scotians are questioning whether it's good for Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the last 4 years, Mr. Speaker, power rates have increased by 30%. And the NDP have legislated, Mr. Speaker, another 3% increase next year. Mr. Speaker, the Premier likes to pat himself on the back for removing the provincial portion of the HST off home heating, but at the same time, the NDP added a tax to every power bill in the province of Nova Scotia. So my question to the Premier, will the Premier explain to Nova Scotians why he champions Nova Scotia Power and supports their every move, but won't stand up for ratepayers in the province?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition is right about one thing. It was this government that took the HST off of home energy, which is the only time it led to an immediate 10% decline in the price of electricity. Mr. Speaker, it is because we have delivered to Nova Scotians not only that particular program, but, Mr. Speaker, we moved out of government Efficiency Nova Scotia so that it could be an independent, arm's-length organization delivering to Nova Scotians the most efficient way to consume the power that they must consume and save themselves money, Mr. Speaker. So Nova Scotians Nova Scotians managed to receive from that program $100 million in savings, Mr. Speaker. $100 million, which if the Liberals had their way, Mr. Speaker, would simply be added on to the bills of ordinary Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, we object to this, and thank goodness they are not the government.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, they removed the HST before they increased it by 2%, so it was actually an 8% reduction, Mr. Speaker, not a 10%. But, Mr. Speaker, on a new question, Mr. Speaker, this government has been sitting on $58 million transfer, Mr. Speaker. You want me to ask a third one, Mr. Speaker, or can I go to a new question? Mr. Speaker, this government has been sitting on a $58 million deferred federal contribution that was transferred to the province through the social housing transfer, Mr. Speaker. Meanwhile, in March 2013, 1,777 families, 2,518 seniors were on a wait list for public housing. So my question to the Premier, why do these families and seniors have to sit on a wait list for housing while the government sits on $58 million of federal money?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Although the Leader of the Opposition understands that there are transfers, he doesn't obviously understand that they are restricted transfers, which means they can only be used for specific program initiatives. What we have done, Mr. Speaker, is we have developed a multifaceted plan for housing in the Nova Scotia, the creation of Housing Nova Scotia, leveraging the portfolio of the Nova Scotia Housing Development Corporation so that we will, over the next 10 years, put more than $500 million into building various kinds of affordable housing alternatives for people right across the province, Mr. Speaker. This will be one of the most visionary programs with respect to housing in the history of this province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
The social housing transfer, the total amounts transferred coming from CMHC over the next 10 years, plus the deferred federal contribution equals $470 million. This government is committed, Mr. Speaker, to $500 million to its housing strategy over the next 10 years. The numbers are pretty close to one another, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier. In the Housing Money Act, is the money for the housing strategy actually new money, or is it money that Nova Scotia is going to receive anyway under the 1997 agreement from our federal partners?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, finally, a good question. I'm glad he asked that one because this is all new money, Mr. Speaker. This will be $500 million of new money, which will allow us to leverage money from other sources, including the federal government, including municipalities, including private investors, including, Mr. Speaker, any partners we can find. If there are universities, if there are non-profit groups, we will use this money to leverage with them to provide the kind of housing that people need.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
I would just like clarification from the Premier. He's talking about over the next years using federal money to lever money in the private sector. That I'm assuming he's talking about using the federal transfers, or is he suggesting he's going to, Mr. Speaker, if the Premier would just let me ask my question, he could probably then answer it. Mr. Speaker, or is he going to actually spend almost a bit, Mr. Speaker, is he going to double the money he's going to spend? And would one of those partners, by the way, be Irving?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I understand that the leader, this is very complicated for the Leader of the Opposition and that he doesn't have any experience in dealing with these kinds of things. But the way that program spending works is that we have a Nova Scotia Housing Development Corporation. They have a very extensive loan portfolio. We're actually able to leverage that portfolio to take money out of it, new money, which will then be used to leverage the federal money from other money out of the province's portfolio. That's right. He's getting it now. I'll speak slowly. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that that money Does he want me to continue to explain it? That money will come out of the Housing Corporation. It will be used to leverage many different kinds of initiatives, whether they come from municipalities, whether they come from universities, whether they come from the private sector, whether they come from the federal government. We will leverage those to ensure that people get new forms of co-op housing, that we assist them with down payments, that we put in place initiatives for new graduates to be able to access housing. I know that disappoints them, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier is trying to convince Nova Scotians that they are about to turn the corner, but his own budget projections show more gloom ahead for all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. The budget itself says that unemployment will grow in each of the next 2 years. 9% this year, 9.1% next year, 9.2% the year after that. And it says that employment, our labour force, will decline next year, Mr. Speaker. That's not exactly what Nova Scotians mean when they say they want to truly turn the corner. Yet despite projecting fewer people working, Mr. Speaker, it also somehow magically says that personal income taxes will increase by 6.8%, adding another $83 million to the budget. That's more than 5 times the surplus that the government alleges that it has. I'll ask the Premier one more time, since his own budget makes so little sense that more people are losing their job, but somehow he's going to collect more income tax at the same time. Will he finally admit the budget is not actually balanced?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know how many different organizations have to endorse the budget for the Leader of the Conservative Party to understand that the budget is not only balanced, it is undergone the most rigorous examination by and been tested against virtually every credible financial monitoring organization in the country. You can take your pick of the banks. You can talk to the Conference Board of Canada, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't matter. They all say the same thing. They all say that the budget, including the Auditor General, they all say that the budget is based, in fact, on very conservative projections for revenue for the next year, and they expect that our budget is completely sustainable.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is none of those agencies have said any such thing. Even the Auditor General, as the Premier well knows, doesn't actually express an opinion on the bottom line of the budget and when it's balanced. So let's turn to the common sense of everyday Nova Scotians. They're the ones the Premier should really be concerned about. And what they see, Mr. Speaker, is that the budget projects that our population is going to decline next year by 0.1%, but somehow magically HST revenue, the take the government has out of the pockets of all Nova Scotians, is going to go up by 6.8%, adding another $80 million to the bottom line, a nonsensical conclusion in a declining population, Mr. Speaker, and that number alone is also 5 times the surplus that the Premier is claiming that he has. So I will ask him, in the interest of common sense, since his budget says there'll be fewer people in Nova Scotia, but somehow they're going to pay $80 million more in HST, will he finally admit the budget makes no sense and is in fact not balanced?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, in fact, what the budget actually does is it projects that the labor force will expand, that the level of income will be higher, and of course, as a result of that, the level of spending will continue to increase, as it does every year, Mr. Speaker. And he's quite wrong. You know, the Auditor General actually gave us an unqualified opinion with respect to the reasonableness of our budget assumptions.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, in anticipation of the Premier's final answer, I do want to table for the benefit of the House the opinion of the Auditor General from his most recent report, where he said there's no such thing as a structural deficit, because I know where he's going to go next, and also the message from the Minister for 2009, the audit financial statements, which show that the Premier inherited a surplus of $19.7 million. So I'm glad the Premier respects the opinion of the Auditor General. Mr. Speaker, in last year's budget, we learned that the Treasury Board knew there was a $27 million error and chose not to correct it and chose not to tell the people of Nova Scotians that their budget contained an error. That is twice the amount of the alleged surplus from this year. So I'll ask the Premier, with such a terrible track record managing the finances of the province, how can Nova Scotians believe anything that's in this year's budget?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we managed to hit every single budget target that we made over the last 4 years. Mr. Speaker, unlike the previous Conservative government, which year in, year out, brought in budgets that had no bearing on reality whatsoever, that they overspent by sometimes $300 and $400 million a year, Mr. Speaker, and then they try to claim that they are balanced. Mr. Speaker, this is a government, a past government, that received $450 million in offshore revenues, Mr. Speaker, and when we got here, there was $20 million in offshore royalty revenues, Mr. Speaker. We had to backfill all of the mess that they made before we could put in place one new program, Mr. Speaker. And yet, in the last budget, we brought in insulin pumps for kids. We replaced the children's dental program that was canceled by the Liberals government. We reduced the amount of tax paid by seniors, and we balanced the budget.
They voted against.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The cyberbullying task force, which was led by Wayne